Hey guys, how's it going? Today, Common and I are going to be... Today, just I am going to be doing a full-length review on the book Wildcat by JP Harker. This is book one of the... It's either Caledon or Caledon. I think it's Caledon saga. That's how you spell it. You know I suck at pronunciations. I mentioned this book in my December wrap-up. I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 9.5 out of 10. And obviously, I had a lot of thoughts while reading it. So today I'm going to be giving a full-length, spoiler-free review on book one. I do now own book 2 and 3, but I haven't read them yet. But let's just get right into it. It is about a badass warrior named Rhea, and it's essentially her story as her homeland is getting conquered, she gets sent to the enemy, and life just will not stop kicking her ass. It's filled with battles and just amazing world building, and the characters are just so layered, and this book just has so many different layers to it that I really enjoyed. Overall, my thoughts on the plot is that it's a concept that I've definitely read before. The basic premise of, a warrior clan and being invaded by a more civilized group. It's something that I've definitely read before, but it was just so well executed, and there were so many sharp turns that I honestly didn't see coming. There was a lot of times where you're pretty sure that you know where the plot was going, and then all of a sudden just something comes out of nowhere and just sideswipes you, and all of a sudden everything has changed. There's actually one of my post-it notes in here. It just says, "Holy fuck, what the fuck, that's a lot," all caps, "of death and bad." Because I figured I knew what was happening, and then all of a sudden just shit hit the fan, and I was not ready for it, and I thought that I knew where the story was going. Like, I thought that I figured out, okay, I've read a similar story before, so it's probably gonna this, and this happened, and then all of a sudden that just came out of left field, and I was like, oh, this isn't what's gonna happen. Okay, what the hell? Then just you strap yourself in and you just go along for the ride. I will admit there were a couple times that the turns seemed a little bit too sharp, and all of a sudden it felt like I was reading a different story, but not necessarily in a bad way, just in a fresh way. I mentioned in my wrap-up that it kind of felt like there's 3 very distinct sections of the book, and they were a little bit too distinct at times, but because I loved all 3 of them, and because I was just so invested in the world, the characters, and all of everything, it really wasn't that bad. It was just sometimes a little bit too sharp of a turn that you almost had whiplash, but kind of in a good way. To finish up my thoughts on the plot, the climax was so just action-packed, but not in a way that got tiring, if that makes sense. It was really exciting and intense, and I could not stop reading it. It made me really happy and really angry and really sad. Like, there was just a ton of things going on, and it was a bit of an emotional roller coaster, which honestly is the sign of a really good book. Like, if I can get legitimately mad that things aren't turning out the way that I'm hoping at every single instant for this character because I am so in love with her, then that just means that I am so invested. And there were a couple times when I cried, not gonna lie. My other huge compliment to this is that the battle was so well paced. I find it sometimes with some stories, the battle is either too fast or too drawn out, or it's just one big blur of action, or it's overly explained, but this book just balanced it so perfectly, and honestly, a good chunk of these is mostly just notes for myself, because there were so many things that reading it as someone who writes fantasy and who admittedly isn't very good at battle scenes. I don't think that my battle scenes are terrible, but they definitely could be improved. And just reading this and seeing how the author set things up and how certain things were executed, it was just really inspiring me for my own writing, and there are definitely so many things that I learned specifically with the battle scenes that I really want to incorporate into my own writing, and just little tips and tricks and techniques. So not only would I recommend this as a reader, but if you're a writer and you write high fantasy or battles or anything with world building, which I'll get to in a second, I highly recommend reading this book because I just felt like so many things were well done that I think I can really improve my own writing after reading something like this. I got off on a little bit of a tangent there, but basically the climax just had perfect highs and lows and lots of action, but wasn't tiring, and it slowed down in all the right places, and it was just really well done. As far as the ending goes, it was definitely a a solid ending and wrapped things up. Like, the main story is definitely finished, but there's still obviously more story to go. Essentially, the main conflict comes to an end, it's satisfying, but you know that there's more to come, and I actually bought the next 2 books in the series before I even finished reading this. I think I was like halfway through the climax, and I just knew that I am too obsessed with this world and these characters, and that was the only time that I stopped reading during the climax, was to quickly take out my phone, go onto Amazon, and buy the next 2 books in the series. But I found the ending was a perfect balance of finishing up the story but setting up what's coming next, and it got you excited about the next book without feeling unsatisfied about this one. As far as the characters go, I thought all of the characters in this just felt so real and distinct and genuine. I loved that they all had their own personal goals and motivations, and everything that they did, all of their actions, were in line with those goals, motivations, personalities, etc. Everything really stayed true to their character, which I thought was really well done, because first of all, the fact that I knew their character well enough to understand all of their actions and all their logic behind everything, but also just the fact that everything they did makes sense, which is something that I always love in a story, when the character's actions feel like it's the character making the actions, not the author choosing for them, if that makes sense. Especially Rhea, our main character. I love her so much. She was such a great character to root for. She was the perfect protagonist because I cheered for her and my heart broke for her, and all of her ups and downs I just really felt. When bad shit was happening to her, and I'm not going to go into any spoilers obviously, but it's a fantasy story. There's a battle. Obviously bad shit is going to happen to everybody at some point, but I was getting so angry at certain parts because I just wanted her to be happy and just have a beautiful life and live happily ever after with everybody that she loves, and everyone would just have this wonderful life, which obviously would be a terrible story, but I just loved her so much that I was getting mad when bad things were happening to her, because I'm like, okay, life, can you just chill for a second? Like, I just want her to be happy. Stop throwing her these freaking curveballs. Which was really fun. I like getting really worked up in stories, if you can't tell. But I love seeing her with her friends, her family, her lovers, her exes, her enemies. Like, just the way that she interacted with everybody and how you got to see so many different parts of her through her actions. I really liked just the way that everybody was connected and how so many different things were intertwined, and it was just really great to see. I loved most of the other characters too, either because I actually loved them or because I loved hating them. And I really liked that there were not very many clear good guys and bad guys. Most of the characters are balanced. They're good and bad, and their actions, like I said, make sense for their priorities, for their motives, and some of the things that they do could be seen as bad, but once you know the character, you realize that it's not them being bad, it's them being human. And that's the thing, a lot of these characters felt really human. My one complaint that I mentioned in my wrap-up is that so many of these names were really hard to pronounce. In my defense, I suck at pronouncing names as it is, and the author is Welsh. Like, the deck's a little stacked against me for that. But honestly, it was really fun. You just have to kind of pay a little bit more attention than I guess I usually do with characters' names, because they're just unique enough that they don't necessarily stick in my head, and sometimes if it's a character we haven't seen in a good chunk of story, I kind of forgot who was who or got certain characters mixed up. So little things like that, just something to pay attention to. But it really didn't stop me from enjoying the story. There was just a couple times where I kind of had to flip back and just double check who we were talking about because I didn't remember their name enough. But all in all, like I said, I really loved all the characters. All of the primary characters had really good character arcs and growth, in my opinion. I loved watching them grow and change, and again, everything made sense, which is one of my highest praises for a fantasy story, because a world has to make sense and for everything to fall in line and be true to the characters, and this really did it so well. But that didn't make the characters predictable because they were human, they were growing and changing, and because of their experiences, some of their actions were affected by that, and it just all made sense. Moving on to world building, the world building shone in this. It was so well done. Honestly, most of these tabs, especially a lot of the early ones, are just specifically really good world building moments because it was so perfectly subtle, like it was never in your face, but you just got such a strong feeling for the world. Again, a lot of these tabs are things that I want to look back on and study essentially so I can learn from them to improve my own writing, because this world is huge and there's so many different cultures and different people that all have their own culture, society, religion, but I understood all of them because it was just introduced so naturally. They were layered and vivid, and all of the information was just layered in really naturally and just sprinkled in throughout the story and through the characters' actions. Even just the language and word choice for some of the scenes had deeper world building implications under them. Like, there's one scene when Rhea is seeing the enemy for the first time, the more sophisticated group, and even just the way that she describes their weapons, like the words that she uses, just really solidifies that her culture isn't advanced in those ways. I just felt like everything was just such a conscious decision, and every word was just picked so perfectly to really get that message across that was completely effortless in reading it. Like, it's kind of like when you're really young and you're learning a second language, you don't actually remember learning it, they just spoke to you in that language and you absorbed it. Like I learned French when I was 5, and I really don't remember ever learning French. They just spoke to us in French and we soaked it up like a sponge, and now I'm completely fluent in French. And I feel like it's the same thing for this world building. It was just so sprinkled in naturally and you just absorb it, and before you know it, you just know everything about this world. Another thing that I have to praise that's gonna sound really weird coming from me, so bear with me, is the sex scenes in this were really well done in a way that wasn't uncomfortable. I'm the kind of person that I don't like reading sex scenes very much. I don't like reading anything that's too erotic. It's just uncomfortable for me, and that's just the way I am. But these were done in such a... I can't even describe it right. First of all, the author didn't shy away from any sex scenes, but they weren't included just for the sake of having sex scenes. Like, they were all really just naturally timed and everything made sense. And they were really detailed but not explicit. They were descriptive in a very like fantasy setting kind of way, and just the language that was used, like, you knew exactly what the characters were doing, but it wasn't in like a dirty way. It's one of those things that if you're someone who's usually uncomfortable with sex scenes, I think these are some of the best sex scenes to read, because they're there for plot reasons and for character reasons, and they're just written in a way that's really comfortable. I really don't know how to put into words, but it's just described in such a similar way to like battles and world building. You know, it's factual without being dry, and it was just, as somebody who is usually uncomfortable with a lot of sex scenes, I really appreciated the way that these were written, and they would just, if I ever write a sex scene for one of my books, which I don't think I will, but if I ever do, again, definitely using this as more inspiration because I just loved the way they were done. Speaking of sex scenes though, there is a trigger warning in this for rape. For the most part, those scenes were included for plot development and for character. Like, most of them weren't unnecessary scenes, but there were a couple scenes, especially very early on, that they mentioned it kind of just to make you hate the bad guys more. And I don't like when it's done like that. For the most part, those scenes were like necessary and had a purpose. There were just a couple instances of them being used wrong, but all in all, if you're uncomfortable with rape, just keep in mind there are some mentions of it and a couple scenes where it's very prevalent, so just keep that in mind. The last thing I want to mention is that aside from the world building, the thing that really shone in this story was just how it was crafted. I mentioned this earlier on a couple times, but everything truly made sense. There really wasn't anything that felt thrown in just for the sake of advancing the plot or anything that just lined up too conveniently. Like, every single thing truly made sense without being predictable, which I think is a balance that is really hard to achieve. Nothing felt cheap or like too much of a coincidence. It just all made sense. Like I mentioned, all the characters' actions made sense for who they were, and the consequences of everything were just so logical, and again, without it being predictable. I can't give more examples of that without giving more spoilers into the plot, but just trust me when I say that it is so well crafted, and honestly, nothing felt just convenient or thrown in there. Overall, I loved this book. I highly, highly recommend it. If you loved detailed world building and well-crafted stories and battle scenes that flow really well and characters that break your heart, like, I highly, highly recommend this book. Again, that is Wildcat by JP Harker. Highly recommended. Please check this book out. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please click the like button to let me know, and subscribe to stay up to date with the rest of my reading and my writing and my cats and whatever else I do. I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday, usually reading or writing related. So I hope to see you guys next time, and until then, have a great day. Bye.